Yeah, so my thesis, it took me a while to get to this point where I did a thesis on the scholastic method. That's really not what I was planning on doing at all. Uh, as as people know who followed my work for a while, my interest is really in the doctrine of union with Christ in particular. And the reason why I was interested in union with Christ is, first of all, some of it's because I come from a Reformed background, and that's a very large topic of discussion in the Reformed Church, right? There's
Yeah.
tons of debates about union with Christ right now. And when I became a Lutheran, I noticed that there was also a lot of talk of the union with Christ in a lot of earlier Lutheran writings. You read it in Luther, you read it in a lot of the scholastics, but also the 19th century writers who I read a lot of when I became a Lutheran, the guys that we publish. And I noticed that that doctrine just isn't really there in a lot of contemporary Lutheran thought. Like nobody ever talks about it. And it was one thing that I, asked a lot about when I was coming from a Reformed tradition. What would you guys say about union with Christ? And it was one of those things that when you ask a Lutheran pastor, they're like, I don't know, like, what are you talking about?
It's a footnote in Pieper. It's
It's
there.
a footnote in
It's
paper.
there.
Yeah, that's it. But
Yeah.
but that wasn't the case historically in Lutheranism. So I wanted to explore kind of why that was. So I first started exploring the topic of union with Christ in my master's thesis, which was published as The Righteousness of One. So I looked at the early church fathers and their approach to justification, and looked at Luther's approach to justification, how that connects to the idea of union with Christ, theosis connected to all of these things. Looking at Tuomo Mannermaa and the Finnish School of Luther interpretation, and some areas of overlap between the Eastern Orthodox doctrine of theosis and the Lutheran doctrine of union with Christ. And that led to the writing of Christification following that. So my goal was always to write a volume on union with Christ, a more in-depth volume, right? Christification is a pretty short book. It's a Lutheran approach to theosis. It's an introduction to the topic. And to say that here's what theosis is in the Eastern tradition, here's what union with Christ is in the Lutheran tradition, it's very clear that there are prominent areas of overlap. And it was always my intention to delve more deeply into that topic following that publication. So I wanted to do a dissertation on that. Now, what ended up happening is I kind of started to explore the question. The major question was, why did this doctrine get lost? What's the reason why people stopped talking about this? And what I found was it really was more of a philosophical shift than anything else. So it was an ideological shift. And when the categories of classical metaphysics disappeared from theological discourse, and especially in certain readings of Luther with a lot of anti-metaphysical kind of biases in reading Luther and earlier Lutheran sources, I understood that that's really the cause of the loss of the doctrine of union with Christ. So I realized I couldn't really treat the doctrine by itself in terms of why it got lost and recovering it without going back to what are the philosophical foundations. So that is really what led me to studying this. So I realized what I've got to do is go back to the basics, right? Go back to the basics of what is reality, essentially the basic metaphysical questions, metaphysics being kind of the study of first things in philosophy, but going back to just the very basic questions of theology and philosophy. And I had to start really with the ground there, and I have to build that before I could treat union with Christ.